Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I want to start by thanking Tim Brophy, Andreas Lemon-Versen, and Marshall Hanning for their kind invitation to be here with you today and speak in this 8th International Symposium for Assessment in Music Education. It's really a pleasure. I want to start also by acknowledging that I speak from Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee lands, and I respect the longstanding relationship that indigenous nations have to this land, and I acknowledge my own responsibility in renewing respectful relationships with indigenous communities through my teaching, my scholarship, and my service. So let's get started. While it seems undeniable that the Western world has experienced a rise in assessment culture, it is at times challenging to ascertain a balanced position regarding educational gains provided by its practice. As a tool for social change aimed at explaining and resolving social and educational issues, assessment writ large has been one of the best efforts put forth by the social sciences. We also know that value-free methods for writing and reading policy have attempted to give technical and scientific sophistication to the policy process in order to buttress its intellectual legitimacy. As this audience knows well, regardless of the many characterized, actualized, or potential positive impacts of assessment, quote, policies of different kinds are consistently oversold to citizens, to politicians, and even to academics. And consequently, whenever engaging with policy assessment or assessment policy, a sober, if not a skeptic, stance may be the most appropriate. I begin today by articulating these challenges and these caveats because this keynote is not focused on assessment per se, but on policy. And in particular, policy understood at the human level, which is to say, policy as an integral, quotidian, near familial element of how we engage in the multiple aspects that shape educational encounters. So today, I engage in an enterprise that, while sober, is also aspirational, born of empirical work, but conceptually driven. Thus, I want to focus on the need to engage more fully with the notion of policy, think the concept differently, while laying the groundwork for the need of a notion of policy practice as teacher practice. So today, I'm going to articulate these issues in the following manner. We're going to look at kind of this new sense of policy and what that might mean, dispelling, kind of replacing some different framings. I want to talk about the idea of policy framing and how that functions with a couple of empirical and studies, kind of current and ongoing work being done that I'm doing. And I want to kind of lead this always intersecting with issues related to assessment and to what our assessment community could do in terms of kind of this kind of sense of cultivation culture, this kind of a renewed presence of kind of a sense of policy know-how is interacting with traditional pedagogical and content know-how. We are awash in policy. Whether acknowledged or not, as a concept and practice, policy permeates the deepest recesses of civil society and has particular impact on the lives of those who are actively connected to the educational process. Writ large, we understand that manipulations of policy texts and policy practices enable social justice just as much as structural racism, cultural plurality just as much as consumerism, consultative practice just as much as power-driven hierarchy. Regardless of such pervasiveness and a growing literature on the absence of local stakeholder voice in educational policy discussions, education and music teacher education have only marginally engaged with policy, its practices, and its potential role in teacher voice and curricular change. I find this a significant gap for us in music education and wonder how would focusing assessment policy debates at the macro micro level where educators operate contribute to a renewed sense of autonomy and accountability within the teaching profession, or specifically music education teaching profession. Policy practice, as I see it, places the possibility of school culture change at the intersection between teacher political environment, and I connect political to policy, so teacher policy empowerment, how we better and more fully embed ourselves in the micropolitics of school, and I will later on talk about governance, and teacher pedagogical empowerment, how we cope with the discomfort of regularly adapting practices. And of course, assessment practice and the changing nature of assessment practice is fully embedded here. If at least part of the challenges we face in education are related to sustained disincentives for teacher-led decision-making related to curricular and pedagogical content and assessment, and UK, Australia, and US offer plenty of evidence that this is a reality, not necessarily that this has an impact, but the fact that there is a disincentive. Then further articulating and investigating the relationships between deliberative policy thinking and distributive policy practice at the district and school level in particular, which is my focus, remained an underexplored and I argue needed area of development in the music education field. Understanding policy as teacher practice could, one, better prepare music educators to engage as active players in the larger ecology of decision-making within and beyond school communities, and help them navigate the complex economic, curricular, and political tensions lived in schools, today more than ever. But before we get ahead of ourselves, it is important to take a moment to consider how and why we might broaden normative understandings of policy. While often policy is understood as a matter of conserving ideas and practices, policy has always and also been related to inquiry and change. Policy is not simply about problem posing in this sense, but also, and particularly significantly, about problem grappling. That is, not simply about foreclosing, but generating parameters for current and future action. At its best, policy work aims to convene opinion, establish debate and directives, and facilitate how to enact proposed ideas and follow up on the outcome of enactment and implementation, where assessment has always been essential. A first step then is in how I want to position policy beyond text and into practice requires that we consider an expansion of the traditional thinking about policy as a limitation to our understandings based on an ecosystem that in practice actually better characterize policy work. And that's what you see in this image here. The idea of policy not just as a confining element, but as a converger, as a form of strategy, as a way of framing, as a sense of innovation and development. Placing ourselves as research, educators, community members in closer proximity and relation to policy as a form of practice, and not just to policies, that is, to policy texts, requires an opening, a kind of systems thinking as represented again in this image. My aim, of course, is not to instruct anyone on the complexities of policy. This audience, dealing as it does with assessment issues, is well aware of the multiple levels wherein policy practice functions. It bears reminding, however, that understanding, practicing, and analyzing policy, both in text as a form of practice, have a rich conceptual and empirical history, one that goes well beyond econometric trends of the last 20 or 30 years, and include a rich anthropological, ethnographic, and discursive traditions from which I draw on today. It is of interest to me that while critical policy analysis, for instance, as Ron Koss articulated recently in 2019, is evident in our field, the conceptual and methodological richness represented in this image to your right with the policy frameworks is only nascently used in music education. Although it's excitingly done so, because there's a real burgeoning set of work that has become really significant. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But what you see here is just a very small percentage of an enormous literature and really interesting sets of practices. I would love to hear more about this, the potential intersections later on in the Q&A. In order to be more specific, allow me to offer a discussion on policy definition, particularly one that has informed my work over the last decade. So I want to start with Kolbach, who distinguishes and asks what work makes policy. It's a great title, a great article. And who distinct that and how he offers kind of a different kind of policy pathways and argues that the way the policy is mapped shapes the way that the process is understood and appropriate forms of actions are identified. So how do we think about it matters in the kinds of decisions that we make, the actions we take, and obviously the assumptions that we carry. The dominant framing sees policy as authoritative choice. And this goes back all the way to Dye and the much quoted works that kind of his words of 1972 work that says that policy is whatever governments choose to do or not to do. And of course, here government should be understood also as any kind of decision-making system or persons. This is to say, in the normative view, the essence of policy is the authoritative decision. And policy work is defined in relationship to decision mechanisms. And of course, this continues even in a kind of more discursive and ethnographic and anthropological, but in a very different way and through and emphasized in significantly different terms. A second and different account, one I am most interested in, recognizes the notion of policy as a form of practice, underscoring the manner and reasons why policy practitioners actually understand the process closer to its sociological nature than outsiders do. Now, Adams does some really interesting work here. This is the quote from Dye, and this is Adams, looking at actual policy practitioners and talking to them about how their views about policy and what it means to engage in policy practice changes once they have had time working in the field. When I ask policy people after a few years of their views of the policy process, I asked them how they have changed. This is Adam saying, the invariable response is that the reality different from texts. People describe to me policy processes constituted not by order and rationality, but by uncertainty, interpretation, contested meaning, power, volatility, compressed views of time and space, and partial information. Practitioners are confronted with constant paradoxes. I wonder if such description would apply to assessment policy practice as well, and how would that resonate to this constituency that us here in this conference. It seems to me that just as with artistic work, ethical, mindful, and implementable engagement with policy work is about regularly renewable understandings. Another way to describe what I have talked about in several other publications about called framing disposition. I'm really interested in the work of Kolbach and Degelin and how they name this kind of distinction, the tension between a sacred account of policy, which assumes coherence and authority and focuses on the outcome, and a profane account, which recognizes interest, context, ambiguity, and focuses on process. Others also speak of this as today's required awareness of the limitations of policy as science, and this is Charles Mansky, work of an economics, and or acknowledge the relationship between policy as a form of art and a craft, right? As a classic work by Wodowski articulates. In other words, it requires not only our ability to identify recurring and established patterns within our context, objectively and empirically, but also our ability to critique and change interpretation, interpretative assumptions, remaining open to implementation adaptability. I think that, if you're intrigued by this, I recommend highly the work of Charles Mansky, Northwestern economist that calls for and kind of does a lot of interesting work around the idea of incredible certitude. And that is the manner in which econometric-oriented social science and social policy in particularly at times overplays data-driven certitude to the extent that it becomes not credible, hence the idea of incredible certitude. It's a great read. This is a recognition that policy is now a field with multiple languages, values, forms, and with multiple individuals and groups as clients as well, as read and articulates. And as such, brings with it a general need for knowledge versatility, where, as Tim Basil argues, an important part of the skill of those engaged in policy is the ability to know which type of knowledge is important at any particular time, close quote, understanding the role of context and seeing at times, quote, the need to do things that are consistent with community's values may be a key debate regardless of practical implications. In other times, the concern of policy implementers and constituents interest groups may be the predominant, while in others, decision may actually hinge on the outcome of a rationalist cost-benefit analysis, as we articulated earlier. The question, does this matter, this change of perception in terms of how we can think about policy, is a self-evident yes to me. The open question seems to be, can and should such understandings play a role in the lives and education of music teachers, for example? Do these function at the meso level and micro level of schooling? Are they significant, and are they significantly at play? And if so, why aren't they integral to teacher education? Perhaps most significant to this audience, how can assessment policy, practice, and research positively intersect with such challenges and such thinking? There's some work by Katina Pollack here, a colleague of mine in Western, looking at principles. And she looks at how this kind of set of capacities, because of a kind of a change in sense of how they understood policy, has actually diminished in terms of the principal training, and has had impact on the governance of schools. I think this really fascinating work as well. Okay, so to recap, I think that if we want to apply kind of a reductive look at what we have talked about here, we see on one side this kind of more instrumental approach to policy, where we're really talking about policy as a form of governmentality, the production of structures and guidelines, to perceive the kind of struggle between challenges and needs, kind of very simple, direct, objective. Processes identified by building capacity, data, and analysis, and then resources and actors are kind of almost one and the same, right? The other side, it's more what I'm calling an engaged policy approach that sees policy as a form of governance. It's a production of communal value. They're kind of situated, it's embedded, it's emergent, always kind of changing and varying. Could lead to potential kind of change in thinking, that's from unitary post-facto analysis to actually what we're going to talk later on, a policy, a kind of analysis for policy, not just of policy. And that really plays on thick and thin interdependencies, multiple levels, it's nested, it's organized in the ways that we talked a little bit earlier on, and we'll talk later. Framing what policy means or can mean is significantly, so I argue, because it is clear to many that the complex issues in and through education are not simply about data or policy themselves, but precisely the way that data and policy are practiced. In other words, the issue is both how do we systematically engage with mindful assessment policy work, in our case, while growing awareness of the deleterious aspects of certain policy regimes. So Maddock and his colleagues, for instance, situate this question at the micro level of the school classroom, explaining how a powerful principle such as accountability can generate, quote, a disturbing source of energy in schools. As accountability takes place in, quote, thousands of daily manifestations. The operating policy regime can establish, quote, pressure, not just to do it right, but to be seen doing it right. Become a source of energy that goes on into creating and sustaining, for instance, a quiet class, busy hum, brisk pace, and satisfying completion of each orchestrated movement of the school day. I don't want to overplay this picture, but the challenge is, this seems similar to the kind of, how do we shift a kind of a more instrumental view of who the teacher is, how schools functioned, and therefore what kind of work can be done, particularly when we're faced with kind of enormous sets of crisis incredible social issues that are still at play, to change requirements, and kind of how do we do our own programs, how do we involve people, levels of participation, all those kinds of things. You know, the kind of outcomes of the coordinative marginal mindful work, or the tragical empty kind of gesture behavioristic structures are really close together. The line is fine. And the work of Martin Fotley, for instance, has over time spoken really, I think, very, very eloquently about the kind of crazy and getting crazier policy environment in Britain. I think it's one of the most compelling aspects of it today. So this is why I'm particularly fond of the work of Stephen Ball, as you see here in the screen, specifically his articulation that policies are very specific and practical regimes of truth, and the way in which policies are spoken and spoken about, their vocabularies, are part of the creation of their conditions of acceptance and enactment. And in so doing, they construct the inevitable and the necessary. I mean, the condition us to think in particular ways. It's basically what they're saying, right? Which I think is really important, particularly for educators to consider. Of course, Ball is not alone, particularly when we turn out our policy eye towards schooling and teaching, where a convincing and growing literature articulates the impact of policy discourse and practice on and of school members, and how powerfully they shape and influence teaching, learning, relationships, governance, reform efforts, and indeed the nature and character of democratic practice within education. This is just a few of them. Perhaps as significant, this work is not just academic, but represented in myriad examples and sites of learning and practice where educators engage in policy practice, develop skills, and engage in also engage in governance. We see this evidence in a resurgence of the conditions of unions, the growth of case-based work done by organizations such as Teach Plus, which is here, arts organizations such as the American for the Arts, the kind of Education Trust, the Arts Fund. The Banff Center here in Canada is doing some remarkable work on Indigenous music leadership and multicultural leadership. And even NAFME has propped up and really changed the way it thinks and operates around policy in the last 4 to 5 years. It is important to note also that in the last years or so, there's been emerging work and similar and even more radical approaches to policy thinking and practice. They have been lifted by dozens of non-for-profits and think tanks working toward multiple social policy environments, all aimed at questions of diversity, equity, and decolonization. All of this activity has served to develop new experience, a significant part of which is connected to micropolitics of policy as a daily practice. Emerging out of explorations on notions that vary from the need for theory, policy as a form of critical pedagogy, to leadership, entrepreneurship, cultivation of dispositions toward policy work and practice. All are constitutive of what I have come to call policy know-how, that is, the capacity to understand, speak, and act with a policy frame of mind that is relevant to artist educators, their programs, their work, as well as to music educators as well, right? Thinking about the same terms. The role of teacher as a policy actor has also been noted, and what you see on the frame there on the right, it derives from the work of Stephen Ball. It has been used recently by Eric Shea in his dissertation and his writings. I talked about that in my latest book, 2020 book. But you see an enormous, for instance, Allison is one of the numerous articles talking about teachers as policy actors. I think that this is really important literature. This has been done in terms of placing then an exploration of actors as in many kind of categories as well, right? In kind of broader categories than specific roles they play as in the previous picture. The kind of policy entrepreneurs and how that really creates a sense of change and it's important. The development of contrasting in new epistemic communities, kind of a sense of confidence of being a discursive agent and having instrumental constituents working within and through this policy process. Again, in organizations, schools, community centers. It's important to know that there is a growing, as I mentioned earlier, research in music education as well. The MEJ, the Music Education Journal, the kind of practitioner-oriented journal, published its first special issue on music education and policy last fall, 2020. And I think that we're starting to see some significant changes here. While I am an optimist as far as change is concerned about these issues of policy and how educators can engage in policy, the role of assessment would be really important here too. I am reminded of Simon Serson's seminal 1971 text, The Culture of School and the Problem of Change, where his nearest slogan, where he says change is good, change is hard, but change takes time. Now, I bring Saracen here to highlight the central and enduring relationships between the teacher and school micropolitics. This is nothing new. In the space where the political grammar is contested and live for teachers. Nearly 50 years ago, he reported that, quote, one of the most frequent complaints of teachers is that school culture forces them to adhere to a curriculum from which they do not feel free to deviate. And as a result, they do not feel they can, as one teacher said, use their own hands. I'm going to talk about some research, my own research, that replicates this to the T. Although we see also at the same time some renewing and some kind of resistance and really interesting work on that too. If you think that this is outdated, this is not just my work, but the Center for Educational Policy has released in 2016 a really interesting report that basically says the same thing. And you can see a little bit of the quote that's also there, all showing not just that teachers are already very much in part of this political process, but also knowing and showing the haphazard manner in which that has happened, and why is it that we are unable to to foster this through professional development, to teacher training, to other forms, and integrate the ways in which teachers can and should function within schools, both from curricular, pedagogical, as well as the governance level, right? A balance between them. Part of what I'm arguing here today, then, is that the distance between teachers' work and policy practice is constitutional to the reality of the school micropolitics, and that this gap is a strong contributor to the deficits surrounding professional and pedagogical adaptability, responsivity, and autonomy. I think this is at the center of what I'm trying to say. That kind of gap is really something that we can do something about. Put in a different way, is our ability to act as full citizens within school environment diminished? So does our capacity to enact change at the classroom pedagogical levels. That's the claim. I believe that codependence has been substantial and never sufficiently addressed. I do think that these relations matter and are formative. I suggest that assessment policies and practice align with such thinking must be leveraged in order for a more systemic manifestation of policy practice as teacher practice to come to fruition. I think that the assessment community is essential in that. So part of what my intention here is to kind of locate the sense of claiming policy. I've done that in a work that in a book that I co-edited with Richard Caldwell, bringing kind of policy views from 14 different standpoints, and all thinking about the kind of sense of the grammar of music policy and how it might impact the way we see ourselves, and the kind of particularly toward these kind of equity-seeking developments in music education. I think that's essential. And I follow here kind of the work of Levinson and all that talk about kind of creative interpretative practice, right, as a formative to what it means to engage in policy work. and central to challenging realities. And schools today, where policy formed within one community of music of practice, right, oftentimes outside the realm of schooling, meets and often clashes with the existential and institutional conditions that mark a different community of practice. As historians Joel Spring and David Tyack have noted in several seminal history of education books, the history of reform, of educational reform, is littered with unsuccessful attempts because of such these kinds of disjunctions. I think that's really important. I want to talk a little bit about a case here in Ontario that demonstrates over this. Have been 2 years ago, we started this process, and we very concerned with a kind of a sense of compromised citizenship. And this is one of the frames and the challenge that we saw in terms of arts and music teaching in Ontario. It's interesting here because in Ontario, teachers are certified to teach at least 2 subjects. So all music students here have a 4-year bachelor, 2-year teacher's college, and in that process they become music certified, but also history or geography or English or whatever, right? And this plays really interestingly in terms of labor conditions and the quality of who gets to be hired, and therefore the kind of qualities of programs that are offered and the conditions of the work of these music teachers within that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. I just wanted to give you a sense of what it is, what we've done. And we collected kind of survey of 534 music teachers, and then we set up about 45 phone interviews with teachers. And at the central, one of the central questions for us was the issue of deprofessionalization, and conversely, what and how teachers are fighting against that. And we found throughout the data several issues related to teacher stress, related to relationships to admin, which actually was a really interesting set of dynamics. Not necessarily negative, but clearly delineating the conditions, usually with teachers that have been teaching for 10, 12 years or less, being much more engaged and much more participative in the process of governance than older teachers. We see from the sense of professionalization, the kinds of things that we expect and that are somewhat familiar to us, right? As these kind of quotes speak about. Because of this kind of labor condition, issues of seniority have really mattered in Ontario politics and the ways that teachers experience their work. This has created some internal ceilings for work. This has also had these kinds of very authoritative environments in terms of governments. We have also created some impediment for change, right? Switching board from board kind of has implication when you lose seniority, and therefore has kind of a dual effect. One, that teachers really fight for change in their programs within the spaces that they are, because they know that they can move. But 2, there's also a high level of conformity that comes into play. So it's been very interesting. And then the kind of sense of deprofessionalization that I think is metaphorically aligned with this idea that, for this teacher and for many others, you just spoke about the fact that the music teacher is called planning, right? The music is called planning, and literally called that in kind of documentation. So I think that's an interesting representation of what that does. But I think that the most significant for us is, and for this talk, is the manner in which teachers talk about engaging in the micro-politics of schools, right? Of creating and re-networking and reorienting their relationships. Again, I can't spend a lot of time on this, but it's important that to know that they notice and they talk about the fractures that exist, right? Such as this person that's here.
I think we're all just so busy now doing our own thing that we're all in the same school working with the same kids, but we're fractured, and that we just
He goes on to talk about how that has changed as he started to participate in groups and committees and do some work outside his master's degree and so forth. A really important kind of change in the way he thinks that and thinks through these issues of fracture. We can see a lot of issues also related to changing in legacy and culture, as this teacher speaks about, and the participation as she does later on, if I can find this, on equity committees.
There is also, I think, in our community a bit of a pushback against that in some of the student population. And so that can create some tension. The population has also changed. The demographics have changed quite a bit over the 12 years that I've been there. So initially it was a very homogeneous European, Eastern European population, lots of people who had lived several generations in the neighborhood. And in the time that I've been there, we've had an increase of immigrants from South America, from other communities. We have a higher Black population now and Muslim population than we have traditionally. And so there are, unfortunately, some racial tensions in our school population that we're dealing with. I'm part of the teacher equity team at the school, and we've been dealing a lot with some pretty overt racism, specifically.
So they go on and talk about that process. And the last, I'm just going to skip for the sake of time. Last one talks about relationships and mentoring relationships across these schools, all of which are part of what I tend to think of this kind of work. Of kind of policy-oriented work. My work with Kelly Bailika in the project based on social justice curriculum and project-based learning exemplifies this also through the voice of the student, the teacher that you see here. And this resonates with the kind of work of Levison and Sutton that started in 2001, exploring the kind of social cultural approach to policy practice, recognizing that the power of authorized policy, as we saw in kind of previous examples, often is in tension with the kind of ways in which policy is appropriated, right? What they call the kind of contestation by multiple actors. And I think that this, and particularly the voice of a teacher such as this, really brings us to the point of asking the question, that I have been hinting here, in what ways teacher music education must address that, and in what ways key aspects of what we do, from content, pedagogical development, assessment aspects, curricular understanding, can be brought together in the sense of thought through this idea of kind of policy work and policy know-how. My upcoming work with Adriana Tilborg in Sweden also shows kind of similar issues in school music leaders and kind of in music schools across Sweden. They see themselves as policy makers, but they realize the decades of trial and errors that made really many unfortunate effects, both in terms of governance, but also in lack of alignment to other larger kind of policy opportunities for them. My work with Tuliki Lines in Finland has shown the kind of policy savvy, the critical development, the first program in Finland to bring together music therapy and music education, and how these contributions in terms of thinking about what does it mean to be a policy practitioner at the ground level had changed a lot of the discourse and had influenced even the kind of Ministry for Culture there. The community environment in Britain is rich with this kind of examples as well. Graham Welch and Catherine Zazeron and have a chapter in the Caldwell's in Mind books of 2017 that speaks very eloquently about this as well. I do want to say that I'm fully aware of these kinds of talks and issues of change often fail to address the kind of sets of costs, right? What you see there on the left-hand side, kind of multiple costs that are part of this process. I do understand that that is a reality, that, the costs of changing, of identity, of kind of feeling imposter syndrome fears, all those. Our research shows that teachers recognize that as well, but that teachers are also already doing that work somewhat on their own. And really, surpassing some of these challenges, right? we know that this has implications, and I think that those are really important in terms of full professionalization, and they are not inconsequential, these challenges. They're quite significant, right? I think that these are really, really important for us to consider, and the National Association for Teachers of the Year speaks very eloquently about this process, right? I think that a lot of this, however, leads to kind of understanding that beyond these kinds of face values, our concern it should be linked to a change in understanding and thinking about policy, not just as an analysis, not just of policy, but how do we engage in processes that create a policy analysis or analysis for policy, right? The idea that analysis is not just a study of contents and outputs, as analysis of policy is, but there has a kind of a different intended agenda when we think about analysis for policy, leading one to consider different actions and value positions so the policy might be influenced and made. That is, policy practice as and for agenda setting. Right, the literature is really rich on this, but I think particularly when we think about assessment, the assessment community, a stronger focus on the production of literature and active engagement in the analysis for policy could have significant impact in music education practice, particularly if it may facilitate practitioners as policy actors engage in assessment policy choices that are, for instance, procedurally aware, more conceptually stronger, collaboratively construed, meaningful to and observant of the needs of the school constituencies, mindful of the normative and counter-normative contributions they may make. Right? I think this is really significant. And I think that an interesting example here is when we think about multiculturalism, for instance. The original idea that was espoused by James Banks had these kind of the model had five characteristics, right, which you see outlined here. But the last characteristic of empowering school culture and social change has been the least really studied and explored, which I think has had an impact on the manner in which these kind of multicultural policies have remained fractured and at the margins. Laurie Johnson has a really interesting book talking about that, and articulates that one of the failures of multicultural policies could be argued to be a consequence of this last and least emphasized element. How do we bring this into the element of governance, right? How do we kind of facilitate these disparate actions into a more integrated manner, right? I wonder if this critique, right, particularly in the sense that the failure in and of governance might have a really important role in the failure to integrate teacher pedagogical and content know-how with policy know-how, right? Failing to establish policy practice structures within school that can sustain and create space for adaptation. It might resonate also within the assessment practice in our field. You know, what the kind of policy conceptualizations that are presented here, what kind of questions you might raise for the assessment community itself. So I'm going to return as I come to the conclusion to this issue of policy know-how. And can we develop a sense of cultivation, a kind of an environment in which we think not just about outcomes, but also more seriously about processes, and the kind of we place a renewed emphasis on the educator as a serious actor within this environment. I think that this is really significantly important if we're able to think in a more integrated manner, if we're able to think more through kind of a systems thinking framework, if you will. And this is one of the suggestions that I have. right? I think that how and in what ways we see the work that we do as music educators as more community-oriented works, meaning the community of the school and the community and the community environment, right? We have, by amplifying the relationality of kind of multiple aspects that are required for our work today, we might also amplify impact. And so when we think about the idea of geographic awareness, meaning context and the impact of context. How do we teach in context within urban, rural, suburban schools? Or how do we teach in context that are subvariants of these three categories? How that might impact and how that should frame my actions according to, the kind of a variable framing disposition. That would bring me to think about policy engagements in a different way, and would place myself as an activism. An activism here, I really mean governance, right? Forms of governments and engagement with governments in a different way, right? So this interrelationality matters to the quality and the experience of the life of school. But I also think that a lot of other things, and I see that the possibility of assessment coming into place here really important, because in the relationship, for instance, between framing and policy engagement, I might have a sense of informed autonomy that is different. In my relationship between policy and geographic awareness, the contextualized analysis and responsivity that I might have changes. Governance and context have an impact on accountability, right? And governance or activism and framing have an impact also on visioning and change management. So these relationships matter, and that's at the center of this kind of policy environment, and that I want to provide and offer here. I believe that the more that we think about, particularly when we look about music educators struggling to adapt to school culture, feeling guilty about the limits of their influence, retrieving to familiar and safe space, I think that a lot of that has to do with a lack of intersection between the kind of policy empowerment and their own kind of traditional pedagogical and identitarian empowerment. I think that we can and should shift this, right? Following these kinds of anthropological dispositions I described here, I've been interested in how and when policy is appropriated, connecting to this micropolitics of school, focusing on what do people do in the name of policy, and how would they do if they thought about policy in different ways. All this comes back to this community, thinking about how and in what ways the assessment piece would fit within this environment and would make a strong contribution to it. I'm really looking forward to a conversation, a Q&A. Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate your time.